I mentioned earlier that I was, as were many anthropologists of the day, early in my career, I was kind of caught up in this this problem of the relationship between the material and the symbolic. And of course, another big problem of the day was the relationship between structure and process. So it was, and generally, Lévi-Straussian structuralism was taken to be unfriendly to process, which I didn't find was theoretically necessary. Reading Lévi-Strauss himself, he just hadn't really developed that dimension of his argument, maybe as much as he could. And so I started looking for, and partly this was in relation to structural Marxism, and I started looking for ways in which Lévi-Strauss could be reconciled with the material world, and to put it crudely. And I was particularly interested in his Science of the Concrete piece, in the way that he treated percepts. And there was something quite generative in that for me, because he sort of turned the usual Saussurean semiotics, almost inverted the usual Saussurean semiotics, and the semantic conventions of the day, you know, the semiotic triangle where you have the sign and the signifier, and then you have the referent. And in Saussurean theory, you know, it's all about the relationship between the signifier and the signified, and kind of the referent or the significatum get left out. And that's, of course, the big weakness. You know, how then does a structuralist account of meaning connect with the world, other than as a pure construction? And of course, I wasn't, although I've used the term knowledge construction, I don't see knowledge as merely a construct. I see it very much as in dialogue with experience and practice and intention in the world. And what I found interesting about Lévi-Strauss was that he was saying, for the science of the concrete, the percept is the signifier. So what would conventionally be left out there hanging in the world as a referent outside the scheme of meaning, Lévi-Strauss incorporates it. It's immediate. It's, in that respect, it's almost Peircean, you know, because then the percept does stuff that is independent. It's autonomous, and it then has to be assimilated in some way to the equation of meaning. So I actually thought that there was an aspect of Lévi-Strauss that was potentially very dynamic. And of course, he did try to get at some of the historicity of meaning through his idea of the bricoleur. And, so thinking about that in relation to metaphor, we have this other kind of bias in a lot of anthropological history, that the indigenous cultures are figurative. They're dominated by the figurative, the symbolic, the metaphoric, if you like. And Western modernity is dominated by the literal, the pragmatic, and so on and so forth. This is a false dichotomy. Of course, it's a false dichotomy. When I worked with Cree hunters and I asked them what's going on in this arena of interaction with geese or with beaver or with bears, they came up with very detailed empirical rational modeling, which would be perfectly intelligible to any scientific researcher, any biologist, any ecologist. Sometimes they would frame those rational empirical models with reference to bigger ideas about the spirit master of the bear or the goose as a spiritual ally of the hunter and so on. But there was this whole sophisticated domain that very much consistent, congruent with scientific understanding. How do the flight patterns of the geese and the diurnal feeding patterns relate to tides, to winds, to different food that the geese feed on? And how then do hunters have to interact with that matrix of activity without upsetting it and disturbing it? I mean, that's part of Cree ecological sensibility, that you're part of these systems without knocking them out of some inherent rhythm, which is good for everybody. Good for the animals, good for us. So in that light, I really came to think that this dichotomy between Western science and various indigenous more religiously inclined forms of thought was a really false dichotomy. And I saw various anthropologists trying to escape that, but really not fully succeeding. Lévi-Strauss didn't fully succeed in kind of escaping that dichotomy. I was really interested in Roy Wagner. I found him and find him still quite inspirational. But he did also buy into this dichotomy between the literal bent of science versus the figurative bent of folks that he worked with in Papua New Guinea. But often you found that the anthropologists who made that dichotomy weren't looking for or looking at that aspect of indigenous knowledge, which would correspond to that very practical engagement with the world. And I suspect that you find it wherever you look. But if you're intrigued by a certain zone of culture, and that becomes your subject, maybe it's hard to find the other aspect. So what really eventually kind of crystallized for me, and I guess one of my first attempts to really think this through was in an article that kind of emerged in a couple of phases, but became the Science for the West, Myth for the Rest, ? Article, in which I made use of Wagner, but felt that, or came to a position that what one has in knowledge systems is an oscillation, always an oscillation between the literal and the figurative. and that it's just not right to characterize whole traditions as dominated by one or the other. I think that even today, when we're getting Viveros de Castro's distinction, for example, between multiculturalism and multinaturalism, I think that is yet another reproduction of this largely false dichotomy. When Crees say, needs mists, needs tsatsak, you and I have the same flesh or bodily covering or form, you and I have the same soul or spirit. They are, Viveros de Castro would see really an interesting, multinaturalism there. But from a Cree person's perspective, I think from a Cree philosopher's perspective, there is this shared, there is a shared world, a world that's shared across species. One thing that I find really useful in Wagner is how he he shifts from he uses some interesting synonyms. So his dichotomy between the figurative and the literal becomes a dichotomy instead between the differentiating and the relational. And that I think is very revealing. Because for a Cree thinker, a Cree hunter, it's very important to differentiate the bear from the human, or the goose from the bear, or at various levels, the beaver in winter versus the beaver in summer. So the frames of thought necessarily involve all kinds of differentiating practice, from very broad scale to quite minute. And the closer one comes to experience, the more the differentiating has to be attuned to the relational, or what Wagner earlier in his thinking was calling the literal. So it's a little bit like the physicist trying to peer into subatomic realms. And so the physicist is focusing on relating. He's assuming, or she's assuming, okay, we've got this particle theory, and we've got these particles, and there's really weird relationships between these particles. But at some point, the relationships put too much stress on the whole model, and the relationships are reconceptualized. But what happens is the relationships force as the relationships are changed, as your relational practice comes to a point of kind of rupture, your concept of the entities must shift. And then when your concept of the entities shifts, you are looking then at relationships very differently. So that's the sort of oscillation between the differentiating and the relational, or the figurative and the literal, that just has to be intrinsic to all human thought, or maybe all thought even beyond the human. I'm sure that there are counterparts of differentiating and relating going on in the perception of and the thinking of geese. So that I think also tells us something about the how we might approach the Western proclivity for drawing hard lines between mind and nature, between human and other than human. I think Wagner's idea helps us. He has this notion that when you work on relational arrays, you precipitate figurative counterparts. And when you work on figurative arrays, you precipitate relational counterparts. I think he makes the mistake of saying one is sort of Western and the other is non-Western. I think Western and non-Western are doing this all the time. And what's different is our metaphors. The Western metaphor is this one of dominion, of natural inequality, competition. And in many indigenous egalitarian cultures, the metaphor is community, is reciprocity, positive reciprocity, versus the negative reciprocity of the West. And it's not that the fundamental processes of thought are different. It's that they're harnessed, they're contained by different metaphors. I don't know if that's as accessible as you want it to be for...
Yes, it is. Is it enough to explain the conflicts you may find between Cree and I don't know, biologists or... But it's just...
Interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure. I might come back to that, if let it percolate a little bit, maybe. So, yeah, I guess that, I mean, the biologist comes with a managerial bias, which is about control. The Cree bias is about relationship and autonomous mutual engagement. So the biologist tends to presume too much about what can actually be managed. Crees are pretty open-ended about that. They realize that there are some things that they need to be doing for certain relationships to be maintained, but there's an epistemological humility which comes with perceiving a world which is full of subjectivity and agency, and it's immoral even to attempt to constrain the other in the way that a managerial paradigm kind of feels like, I think, to a lot of Crees. But it's not such a big gulf. I think that we, in our moment of the ontological turn, are seeing all kinds of incommensurabilities which are not actually so incommensurable. You know, when certain animal populations crash, the biologists and the Cree hunters can agree there's a problem here. Their approach to that problem takes some negotiating, but I don't think it's beyond. I don't think it's an irresolvable difference. I think that's a world we have to anyway. We've got significant enough problems globally that if we cannot find a community of shared action, we're cooked. I mean, literally, we're headed to being cooked, aren't we? I like it. I like Tim Ingold's good on this. You know, he so let's stop talking about ontology. Let's talk about ontogenesis. You know, because an ontology is just a momentary product, isn't it? It's a product of interaction. So let's get on with interacting and communicating and figuring out, you know, what's our shared mission, or what's our shared what can we agree on, and what's going to be our consensual project.